Happy Friday, everyone. Welcome to the Sustainability Talks during Texas A&M's Virtual Earth Month. Happy to have you here with us today. So today we have a very interesting talk looking at racial discrimination in our country and making some connections to COVID-19, but also kind of looking at the historical, some of the historical things that we know about that explain this topic. So that's what we'll be discussing today. And just some logistical information. If you have questions over the course of this chat, please put that in the chat box, and I'll ask those questions at the end. You are able to turn on subtitles if you need to. And also at the top of the screen near where it shows my name that I'm sharing the screen, if you click the more button, you can put your mode in side-by-side mode, and it will be a lot easier so you can see the whole PowerPoint, and then you can see the speaker at the same time. So that is an option that you can do. So without further ado, I have Shreya Veeravelli here with us today, and she is going to be talking to us, like I said, about racial discrimination. And she is a food science major, class of 2023. So without further ado, I'm gonna pass it over to Shreya. She's gonna share her screen and she's gonna take it away. So whenever you're ready, Shreya.
Thank you, Ben. Hello, everyone. Welcome to my presentation on racial discrimination and the limits it presents in places in society. Before I get into the bulk of my presentation, I wanted to define racism, which may seem an obvious term to define. However, there are many different terms to define racism, one being structural racism. And I encourage you to research such terms more after this presentation. However, for the sake of this presentation, we will be focusing on this specific definition, as this is where most people's understanding of this topic starts. And I myself am very new to this topic, so I'm not as well versed in the sociological implications and the specific terms associated with it all. But I think it is a very important area to learn and grow in, as it is very relevant in today's society, especially in the context of COVID, which I will get into later in this presentation. So going off of this very basic definition of racism, I wanted to point out how many people are familiar with the first part of this definition: prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism against someone of a different race, and belief that one's own race is superior. However, it's in the second part that many people leave unconsidered: the belief that all members of each race possess characteristics or abilities specific to that race, and so on. So many people who are not racist participate or simulate racial bias, and that is a big area where these limits start. They will automatically associate one characteristic upon an entire race. So throughout this presentation, I wanted to demonstrate areas of racism and how it has placed a barrier for so many. So before I go into specific examples, I wanted to give a background on the type of mindsets surrounding racial discrimination. In Racism and the Limits of Distributive Justice by Kevin M. Graham, Graham introduces the inconsistencies present in the ideologies of well-known philosophers John Locke and Immanuel Kant. John Locke argued that all persons have the freedom to be governed only by a state to which they have given their consent, and that all persons have a moral right to ownership of the fruits of their labor. However, then he saw no issue with the legalization of slavery. Then Immanuel Kant viewed all persons as having an intrinsic moral worth that entitles them to be treated never merely as a mean, but always as an ends in themselves. But he also then believed that the human race is divided into several races that are hierarchically ordered, with white Europeans on top and Africans and Native Americans at the bottom. These contradictions of liberal political philosophers emphasizes how individuals often do believe everyone is equal, and preach it as well. But sometimes our actions say otherwise. As society becomes more complex and divided, we allow racism to take form, and we almost pick and choose where we apply our values. And this is what leads to systemic bias that constantly limits individuals of certain backgrounds. An example of how the system constrains is within our prison system. Black, Latino people, and lower income individuals are more likely to end up in prison, even though they are not more likely to commit crimes. Alice Goffman, a published author in this area, in her TED Talk on how we're priming some kids for college and others for prison, She speaks of an instance that demonstrates how racism limits those who are trying to break free from their economic barriers and social situations. Goffman talks about this instance where an African American male responded to a white male calling his mom a crack whore at his school. The African male, who Goffman called Chuck, pushed him into the snow. It was not a severe push, the other kid was fine. However, Chuck was charged with aggravated assault. Chuck was a senior at this point and he could not afford to pay bail, and the trial dragged on throughout his entire senior year. Fortunately, the judge ruled in his favor and he won. However, he did come out with some court fees that he had to pay by a certain date. Now, as his whole senior year went to fighting the charge, he tried to re-enroll into school. However, since he was 19, the school said he was too old to be readmitted. Then came the time when his fees were due. Chuck was unable to pay them, and now suddenly he had a warrant out for his arrest. He had a permanent mark on him now. He was a high school dropout, a warrant out for his arrest, and he was left with no choice but to run. Now, I know it wasn't good to act with aggression. However, to have to be on the run for the rest of his life because of it, I don't think he deserves that, and I don't think anyone really deserves that, especially when those in areas of a more wealthy, privileged background would not get the same level of punitive action. That fight would have ended at the school. The system fuels the disparities between different ethnicities, prolonging the cycle of racism seen in police brutality accounts when innocents lose their lives. People of these ethnicities are forced into stereotypes that they've had no choice to live in. They were not taken for their character or the potential they can offer in society. They are limited by their background and unable to grow. This is the disparity that fuels racial discrimination and places limits that don't let individuals truly grow and maximize their potential. I wanted to include these pictures here to just give you a visual on the dichotomy between the two different neighborhoods. Statistically, the neighborhood showcased in this left-hand corner have higher populations of lower income people of color, whereas in the other wealthier neighborhood typically house white populations. When African Americans are faced with racial backlash on their economic levels or their record, people fail to understand it is the systemic bias that results in more African Americans being put in prison. They are socially isolated and targeted by police officers to make arrest counts and are more severely punished than if that same situation would have taken place in this right-hand picture. These unequal levels of punishment presents a clear disparity in our system. Now, another area to consider racial discrimination in is in healthcare. These quotes were taken from a study assessing social discrimination in healthcare. She, my mother, didn't have adequate care, and because I don't speak English very well, they didn't pay attention to me, said by a Latina participant. And then, how they separate us with insurance from those without insurance. I don't like that. Everyone should be able to see a good doctor. You can see it and feel it, said by an African American male. These quotes exemplify how people of minority ethnicities receive inferior or an insubstantial level of treatment compared to majority populations of non-Hispanic whites. I wanted to emphasize this last quote here, which brings the issue of universal health care into the forefront, which is a whole nother topic for another presentation. But however, it's still very relevant as those typically without insurance usually come from a Latino or African American background, and they are often turned away from treatment, which could explain such statistics as African Americans have an infant mortality rate that is twice as high as that for whites. Or in 2017, African American mothers were 2.3 times more likely than non-Hispanic white mothers to receive late or no prenatal care. Such statistics undoubtedly show the pervasive social discrimination persistent in our healthcare system and how it has placed limits in an individual's effort to receive proper treatment. Without having the adequate treatment to service our health needs, how can anyone reach their full potential and be an active member in society? This is an obvious demonstration of how social discrimination places limits on society and constantly places people of a certain demographic into the shell, per se, without letting them grow and prosper. Another area where racial discrimination is present is in housing. Racial inequality can often be subtle in certain situations, however, it is still very much present. To touch on one example of just how difficult housing can be, I wanted to bring up James A. White's personal experience, which he detailed in his TED Talk, The Little Problem I Had Renting a House. 53 years ago, White had just joined the U.S. Air Force and had just moved to Mountain Home, Idaho, and was on the hunt to find an apartment for his young family. Personnel said he would have no trouble to get a house. because airmen are always ideal to have as a tenant, as they are good providers and will pay the necessary rent at the right time. Basically, airmen had a very good standing in the community, and so White should have had no problem getting a house. Well, that was not the case, as you already know. So he got a list of potential apartment locations and he called them beforehand, and the lady who picked up was enthusiastic and said there were like 4 to 5 apartments available and he can choose from a one bed or 2 bed. And he was told to just come on down and White could pick whatever apartment he wanted. White was very happy to find an apartment so easily. He goes down there and meets with the lady and tells her he's ready to make a selection. Finally, I guess being able to see White, she says, "Oh, my husband rented all the apartments without letting me know." How could all 5 of the apartments available be taken in the hour it took White to drive down to the apartment and the call he made to her? Definitely suspicious. White had no choice but to try again, and once again he heard from personnel that there was an airman who was leaving and lived in a trailer, and that he could potentially buy from him. It was a small trailer. However, White was helpless, so he bought the trailer from the airman, and the trailer was already in a trailer park sitting on its own piece of land. So White thought it would solve all of his problems if he could stay in the same spot, and so he would not have to find another location. So he asked the airman if he could just leave the trailer here. The airman said he would have to check with management, and White gets a call later that day, and apparently management said that specific spot was promised to someone else, which again was suspicious because there were several other spots open, and it was just that specific one that was taken. Once again, White had to print out an exhaustive list for trailer parks. He went to one after another and got the same rejection as he did with the apartment. He was met with comments like, "Jim, the reason why we can't rent to you is because we already have a Negro family in the trailer park, and it's not me because I like you people. But here's the problem, if I let you in, the other tenants will move out." First of all, saying "I like you people" is the kind of talk that people will converse that is inherently racist. Nevertheless, White found a trailer park. It was small, lacked proper fencing, slot divides, laundry, and more basic necessities. However, he did not have very many options, so he chose it. This story demonstrates the everyday racism that people orchestrate, which they don't think is a big deal when they turn an African American family away or they avoid. Now, people will say, "Oh, I'm just protecting myself." How exactly are you protecting yourself? Are you protecting yourself from a social construct? I believe there is the potential for danger in everyone across all ethnicities and backgrounds. So we should work on not discriminating against a specific one. Another major limiter associated with racial discrimination is access to jobs and one's potential to rise in economic status, otherwise known as economic mobility. Black and American Indian children have substantially lower rates of upward mobility than the other racial groups. What this means is that Black children born to parents in the bottom household income quintile have a 2.5% chance of rising to higher levels of household income, whereas it is 10.6% for whites. Furthermore, there is no guarantee for an African American or American Indians to stay in the top quintile if that's where they are, because this doesn't insulate them from the disparities present in society. Thus, they are more likely to endure higher rates of downward mobility in economic level. This calls affirmative action into question. If the systemic bias present in society is constantly sticking African Americans and American Indians back into the same hole, should we not have some policy that to some extent does undo that? I think such circumstances need to be considered, whether it be for creating a new set of policies or altering old ones. This graphic here shows how people of color are overrepresented in the lowest paying jobs. These points that have been made throughout this presentation are just a few examples of how racism is clouding the judgment in areas and is limiting for individuals. In the current situation of COVID, racial discrimination is definitely in the forefront of people's minds and is leading to people attacking Chinese people. As I just said, recently there has been an increase in racial discrimination against Chinese people or those of any Asian race due to COVID. People are hating on individuals of Chinese descent since the origins of the virus are in China. However, what people fail to see, the real issue here is the regulations and the laws involving wild animal trade. Wild animal trade is not only prevalent in China, there are locations all over Asia, Europe, and Mexico. The reality is that this could happen anywhere. Thus, focusing on only China as the sole reason is not legitimate. Xenophobia is taking away from the major issue of wildlife trade. This whole situation hits close to home for me, as I had a Korean friend who was raised in El Salvador called with racial slurs on her way to Target. Despite being Korean and living her whole life in El Salvador, and even if they are Chinese, that should not have occurred. We need to learn to spend our energy in combating the virus and stopping its spread and not constantly trying to blame others or discriminate against other races. How can we fix this? We can become educated, have these conversations and acknowledge our biases and work on changing them. This may seem as a simple answer. However, studies have shown many people really don't understand what they're doing and what they're saying and how it can be racist in its effects in society. Having these conversations and bringing these types of situations to light is an important mechanism to nurturing and teaching others how to coexist with others and represent their values in their value systems and their ethnicity. To touch on this last point, in 1960s, when Black activists secured landmark civil rights legislation, certain agencies were created to protect people from discrimination in the workplace, such as the U.S. Equal Employment Commission. However, they were left underfunded and not able to hold employers accountable for their discriminatory practices. I think maybe making sure that the government follows up on such agencies and how their policies are being implemented is another way we can alleviate the limits racism creates in our system. These are some of the references that I've used, and thank you for joining me, and if you have any questions, please let me know.
All right, thank you, Shreya. That was really well done. It looks like you were able to learn quite a bit of new information, and thank you for that. And we do have a question. So being new to this topic, what were you most surprised to learn when conducting your research?
What I was most surprised to learn was, I guess, like in the healthcare system, like truly how big the level of treatments are between other races, and like actually seeing the statistics on that it just really showed the reality of the situation. So that was interesting to me. So that was definitely something I learned new.
So when you think about like the healthcare system, and you saw and the disparities that you saw in the healthcare system, and then also the historical disparities that you saw in like housing discrimination, were you able to make any connections to like what we've seen with COVID-19 and how typically people of color, Black Americans, and Latino Americans have been more likely to have more complications to COVID? Did you see anything like that?
Well, I like the biggest thing I feel like is just like fear. People like will use fear as an excuse and discriminate against people, and will use that as an explanation to either turn down treatment or to avoid other people. And I think that's something that everyone needs to work on and really acknowledge their biases and everything.
Cool, thank you. So here's another question. First, she says, great presentation. What might you say to someone who may not be interested in becoming educated or learning about their biases?
If they're not interested in becoming educated, then if someone else who has different beliefs or value systems as you, and it clashes with your interests, don't like say anything against them. Like you have to be open to having conversations. So you don't have to necessarily like read all these pages and articles, but you can have conversations with other people and not, I guess, like push your beliefs on someone else and say anyone else is less significant or anything like that, but really having like a conversation where it's just an exchange of ideas and knowledge, not anything like discriminatory. And yeah, I think that's one way.
So kind of like what you're saying is you may not be able to necessarily change their mind with one conversation, but trying to have the conversation is kind of like a starting point.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
Okay, great. Let's see if we'll have any more questions come in. Oh, they're just asking, can we access the recorded presentation afterward? I can answer that. Yes, we will. All of these talks, we will have recorded versions, like a YouTube version. Unfortunately, when we download the recorded version, the closed captioning doesn't save or work for some reason. But we will post these eventually. It will probably be at some point when everything is done, we'll have everything posted, and it'll be on the same exact website that you found these links on. The Zoom link will eventually be replaced with a recorded link. So yes, that would be great. Everyone else is just saying great job. Thank you, Shreya. So I don't think there's any other questions that are going to come through. So again, great job. I know you're new to this topic, but I think you definitely shed some light on a really important issue, and it's exciting to see you grow in your knowledge in this. So thanks again for your efforts, and thanks everyone for tuning in. And we definitely hope to see you at our sustainability talks. They resume next week. Give me a second. This is my fault. I should have looked this up. What is our next talk? So our next talk is we have three talks on Monday, April 27th. So the first one is going to be at 10:30, and it'll be about travel and tourism, and that is a faculty member, Dr. Tazim Jamal. And then the next one we'll have is the lessons that we can learn from COVID-19, and how do we apply those to the climate crisis. And that will be another one of our student interns. Lily will be giving that one. And then at 4 p.m. on Monday, Michelle is going to talk to us about COVID-19 and domestic violence, how the shelter-in-place orders are affecting victims of abuse. So some really interesting talks coming up on Monday. Really hope to see everyone there. And again, thanks Shreya, and thanks everyone for tuning in, and hopefully we'll see you next time.